But no, Keith, this is going to be cool, man. Like I said, I think for those that don't know, March Madness kicks off today. And Keith, I found your book a couple of weeks ago, Heartland, about Larry Bird, and I was like, man, what is this? And Keith, then I discovered a lot of your other books as well, and I was like, man, I gotta get Keith on the podcast.
Well, I appreciate you finding me, Chris. It's great to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Keith, to kind of kick things off, just you've been writing for a long time. You're a New York Times best-selling author. You've, like I said, you've got several books, but Heartland is your latest one that came out this month, and it tells the story about Larry Bird, Indiana State, his whole story there. And I actually, we hear all these great things about Larry Bird and his Hall of Fame career and the Indiana State good, the good, I guess, notes of the story, but I personally wasn't aware of the backstory of Larry Bird. Very easily could have gone a different path, and we never may have even heard of him. But talk a little bit about your book and how you came across the story, and just your process of getting it all together.
Yeah. Well, so Heartland is an origin story. This narrative unfolds between 1973 and 1979. It unfolds almost exclusively in rural Indiana. Everything after 1979 is epilogue material for me. And the reason why I wanted to write it this way is really a simple one. I feel like every time we've come to this story over the past 50 years, we always tell it one way. We always do the Bird Magic story. We weave together the story of Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. And listen, I understand why we do that. Of course, as a storyteller, Bird and Magic will play against each other in that epic championship game in March 1979, the most watched college basketball game of all time, 50 million viewers. And then they're going to go on to change and redefine and save the NBA, both becoming icons. So I get it. But the reality of the situation is this: in the 1970s, Bird and Magic barely know each other. They've met one time. In that one time, they've hardly spoken. So, they're not friends. They're not rivals. They're not anything. Magic Johnson to Larry Bird is no different, than Sidney Moncrief, a great player for Arkansas who Bird
Right.
plays in March of '79, or Mark Aguirre, a great player for DePaul who Bird plays in March of '79. So, what I really wanted to do here was tilt the camera just a little bit differently and change the perspective and zoom in on this origin story. And when you do that, what you get is almost a completely different story.
Yeah.
And maybe more compelling, you get this totally new cast of characters. People who were around Bird in the 1970s who do form and change and at times save him. That's the story I'm trying to tell in Heartland. And I think it's far bigger than a sports story. I think it's just a compelling human narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and like I said, Keith, I had never been introduced to this part of Larry Bird's story. I've always thought it's incredible that, yeah, Magic, Larry, they play in college and they go on to this incredible, rivalry throughout their NBA careers. But that's kind of all we look at. We just talk about greatness and how awesome they were, but we haven't taken the time. No one has until you to really dig in to the backstory before all of that and put that out there and talk a little bit more. Don't give too much away because I want people to pick up your book and read it, but tell a little bit about because Larry Bird almost didn't even go to college. He went to work for a trash company, and I again that's such an incredible thing to learn because I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I think, sports fans, Larry Bird fans, Celtics fans will know the broad strokes, that, Bird grows up in French Lick, Indiana. He briefly has a chance to play at Indiana University for the great Bob Knight. Then, doesn't last there, leaves after just 3 weeks, ends up back in French Lick where, he does get that job working for the city street department, where among other things, he is collecting the trash. I think people know the broad strokes, but it's far darker than that, far more troubled than that. French Lick in the 1970s, is an incredibly poor town in Orange County, Indiana, which was the second poorest county in Indiana in the 1970s. So it's a really hard place to grow up. Bird's family struggles financially. His father struggles personally. Unemployment at times in Orange County in the 70s is hovering at 18, 20% unemployment. Bird's father struggles with that. He struggles to hold and land jobs, struggles with drinking. For all these reasons, Bird isn't really dreaming of going to college. He isn't dreaming of playing the NBA. Those are dreams far too absurd for a boy to have in French Lick in the early 1970s. He just wants to play on the varsity basketball team at Springs Valley High School. That's it. And this is a tiny little school, with a tiny basketball program. They don't typically compete for anything there in Springs Valley. And in his first 3 years as a player there, Bird is never the best player on his own teams. He's a good player, but he's not turning any heads. I interviewed one guy who played for a rival school, a man named Bill Butcher, plays for a rival school heading into the Bird senior year. He told me he didn't even know who Bird was, even though they had played them every year. So, this is Larry Bird. And then, he has a growth spurt that's frankly going to change history.
Yeah.
In between his junior and senior years, Bird grows 3 or 4 inches, an incredible growth spurt. And now it's different. He's 6'7" now, 6'7". Now he's turning heads. Now people are coming, and Bobby Knight does recruit him. But Bird isn't considered a top 15 player in the state of Indiana. In the state of Indiana, I think it's important to restate that people thought there were 15 players better than Larry Bird. He doesn't last at Indiana and really then does have this dark winter coming home where I do believe it is very possible that Bird could have slipped away forever.
Yeah. And we would have never had the incredible stories or matchups or any of that. And it's I mean, I love stories like this, Keith, because you're a big sports guy. Obviously, I'm a big sports guy, and obviously you like the rooting for the games and all that. But it's the stories of the athletes that really get your heart. You learn about these guys, and and all of a sudden you feel like you know them. Which I'm sure as you got to do all these interviews and learn about all these things, which kind of leads me to another question for you, Keith. It's as you were digging into putting this book together and interviewing people and learning things, what were some things that really surprised you? I know there's, like you interviewed the guy and he's like, I don't even know who Larry Bird was, but what are some things that you were like, wow, that's insane.
I mean, so much, honestly. I am a sports fan in general, but I would say all I knew about Bird going into this project was those broad strokes.
Yeah.
French Lick, Indiana for a minute, Indiana State, Bird Magic saves the NBA. I know the broad strokes.
Yeah.
So I learned so much, and I'm always learning so much when I'm doing a project. A couple things. I mentioned a minute ago that, Bird was never the best player on his own teams until that senior year of high school. I think another thing for people to know, parents or grandparents out there, none of this was destined. None of this was written. It didn't have to happen this way. And even after Bird is playing on the varsity team at Springs Valley High School, he isn't always, driven for greatness. As a boy, there were days when his head coach, a man named Jim Jones, a man I interviewed, he's in his 80s today. There were days when Jim Jones had to go into the house and wake Bird up just to
Yeah.
get him to come to school. So what I've learned over this project and my last book on Pete Rose, called Charlie Hustle, is that yeah, these athletes who go on to become icons, they do have certain qualities about them that are going to, drive them to success.
Yeah.
But in both of those cases, there were people around them, who lift them up, who push them forward, who carry them at times in the darkest times. And that's certainly true with Bird. And again, in our efforts over the years to tell this story, we've oversimplified it to the point of almost being wrong.
Yeah.
One character, who's been mentioned in past stories but never really has gotten his full due, who is an important protagonist in my book, is a man named Bill Hodges. You know, Were it not for Bill Hodges, I do believe, we don't know the name Larry Bird. Uh, he never leaves French Lick. He never returns to college. I do believe that. In the spring of '75, 10 months after having left Bloomington and Bobby Knight in Indiana. Larry Bird is in a very dark place. He has come back to French Lick. He is briefly enrolled in vocational school, briefly played for the basketball team there, then quit that team, quit that school, then gotten that job working for the city street department, where, among his other duties, he's collecting the trash. While all that's happening, his father is fully unraveling, tragedy at the doorstep of the birdhouse. And by the spring of '75, Bird is telling everybody, including his mother, that he's not going back to school. He's done. And one thing I've learned about Bird over the course of this project is, when Bird says something, he means it.
Yeah.
And he almost always follows through. He's incredibly consistent like that. And in that moment in time, this man, Bill Hodges, shows up in French Lick. Bill Hodges is a journeyman assistant coach, newly hired at Indiana State. He has moved on from 3 different schools in 3 years. He's gone from Tennessee Tech to Armstrong State to Indiana State. Not really moving in the right direction here. Hodges only gets the job at Indiana State because he knows Indiana. The new head coach at Indiana State has spent most of his career in New Mexico and Iowa. He doesn't know Indiana. And Indiana State isn't going to be recruiting nationally. Let's just be honest. They're going to be recruiting in small towns in rural Illinois, rural Indiana. And so, the head coach needs someone who knows the state. Bill Hodges does. He knows every little bandbox gymnasium in every little town. And, gets the job for that reason and goes down to French Lick looking for Larry Bird. You know, uh, just pause here for a moment. In 2026, a talented athlete in a rural community, poor rural community like French Lick, would have a team around him or her from the age of 16 or 14,
Yeah.
a team of handlers, agents, lawyers. You wouldn't go looking for them today. They would come looking for you,
Yeah.
even in a poor rural community.
Mhm.
Uh, Bill Hodges is driving the streets looking for Larry Bird, finds him, and then really connects with him. Hodges is still alive. He's in his early 80s. He's stubborn like Bird. He's from rural Indiana like Bird. He's a straight talker like Bird. And those two men have a connection, which is why Bird ultimately agrees later that summer. Okay, fine, I'll come back to school.
Give it one more chance. And it worked out. Better than he could have expected. But Keith, again, I think this is so cool because I mean, you mentioned super fans or fans of a certain era know the basic facts of some of this. But like you also said, the good story's been told so many times that the base of it kind of gets forgotten, especially for guys I think my age, where we know Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, those guys, but we didn't follow them, we didn't watch them play really, and now they're just almost like they're legend status. All we know them as this great finished product, but we haven't really. I've never looked that deep into Larry Bird. I just think he's top 10 greatest player. Everyone always talks about how great he is, but um, I think it's important to share the struggle piece to it too, because that's kind of again, I like highlighting these stories on books for guys because I always say this all the time. You see greatness outside of sports too, and people just see the highlight reel and go, "Oh man, they're awesome. Like everything they touch is gold." But I love learning about the struggle that these successful people have because it puts them in line with you on a certain level where you're like, "Hey, I've got problems I'm dealing with too. If they can Larry Bird was picking up trash. Well, shoot, what I'm doing is not really that bad, and look what happened to him." So, as a broader message, I think it's important to share these stories with people, and so you can see the mountains they had to climb and the struggles they had to deal with to get to where they were because it wasn't could have gone a totally different route.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel like, again, because we've always been enamored by the bird magic story,
Yeah,
we have really just missed this incredible story sitting right here, just to the left,
yeah,
right here.
yeah,
Uh, I do believe that this is an underdog story that then is ultimately wrapped within another underdog story, because you know, uh, even after Bird gets to Indiana State, no one cares.
yeah,
No one expects anything. It's Indiana State. They're not even in a conference. They're teetering on the edge of Division Two. They're drawing crowds that are smaller that are being drawn by high school teams in Indiana.
yeah,
That's where this begins, and where it ends is just completely different. And
yeah,
again, skipping ahead, for those who were alive in '79 or remember the story or grew up on the myth of the Bird Magic game,
yeah,
that draws that enormous television audience, 50 million viewers. Uh, in the days before that Final Four, NBC, the network that broadcast the NCAA tournament in those days, the only network that carried games, by the way, it was only
yeah,
one place to watch them, uh, wasn't talking about Bird Magic. Executives there weren't talking about Bird Magic. What they were talking about out loud in the newspapers was Indiana State,
yeah,
this Cinderella story from nowhere, steamrolling into the Final Four at 32-0.
yeah,
That's what the NBC was talking about. And as one NBC executive says, again, out loud, about 3 days before the Final Four, if Indiana State is in the finals, we will go over the top. And I do believe that's true. I think, if it had just been Bird and this ragtag Cinderella underdog team, now coached by Bill Hodges, in the finals playing anybody, that NBC would have set a viewing record, even without Magic.
yeah, yeah. That's incredible. That's incredible. Just again, it's just one of those sports moments and stories where you're just like, and which kind of Keith, I want to ask you this because your other books too, Charlie Hustle, Fly Girls, incredible books that again, New York Times bestsellers. What's your process or like a book like this, how do you I don't know, how do you get introduced to the story? And then how does your curiosity, I guess, the path, what path does it take for you to really go down the rabbit hole to say, like, I've got something here? And just, from an author standpoint and writing, pure question here, what's your process and how do you go about determining what you want to write about and then putting in the work to put this together?
Yeah, great question. You're using words that I use, curiosity, rabbit holes. I mean, this is what I do.
Yeah.
This is what nonfiction writers do. Just to the right of me right here on my office wall, I got like 10, 12 ideas, jotted on scraps of paper, taped and tacked to the wall. Some of those may become magazine stories or NPR stories. Some of those will die completely.
Yeah.
I'll tear them up and throw them out. Maybe one will become the next book.
Yeah.
It does begin with curiosity. Begins by just thinking about ideas. I do believe that journalism, storytelling, it's an idea business.
Yeah.
Not all ideas are created equal. It is about your perspective, your framing of the story. I think that's crucial. I'm always thinking about ideas. If I'm in a conversation at a backyard barbecue and someone's telling a story about their work life or their grandfather or whatever. I'm thinking, well, is this a story? I mean, this is just how my mind works.
Yeah.
And then once you have an idea that you're pursuing or thinking about, or you sort of can't stop thinking about,
Yeah.
you do go down the rabbit hole. And, a lot of rabbit holes end up dark, and end up dead ends. But every once in a while, that rabbit hole goes deep and you start to feel like you can do this.
Yeah.
A book is, you know, most readers don't think about it this way, but a book is like an 80,000 or 100,000 or 120,000 words.
Yeah.
Not every story can carry that kind of length.
Yeah.
So you do need to think critically about it. And it does often take weeks of just, reporting on the fringes, trying to figure out what are the beats of this narrative. What are the highs and lows? Where does it start? Where does it end?
Yeah.
Because that's another choice that a writer is making.
Yeah.
Where does this story start? Where does this story end?
Yeah.
Okay, and if that's the framing, who are the protagonists who populate this world? Who are the antagonists who populate this world? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? What is the arc? I mean, these are things that need to be sorted out long before you say, "Oh yeah, I'm writing about this."
Yeah.
And for me, it often takes weeks, maybe a few months to line that all out.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And obviously you're proud of each piece of work that you've put out there. But what book for you was the most challenging to the point to where you're the most proud of finishing and putting that book out there?
It's such a great question, and, it's so hard to answer because every book has its own unique challenge, its own unique obstacle. I would say in every book I've done, that unique obstacle often feels insurmountable, and you do
Yeah.
wonder, am I going to be able to do this? I think there is a point in every project where you do wonder that and ask that question.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's hard to answer, but I won't dodge it. I mean, I could give an answer for every book.
Yeah.
I could answer that question with an example from every book.
Yeah.
But I'll say this. You mentioned a book that I wrote a couple books ago, a book called Fly Girls.
Mhm.
Again, narrative nonfiction. All my books are narrative nonfiction. It's a story about female aviators in the 1920s and 30s fighting for the right to fly and race planes. It's essentially a story of Amelia Earhart and her friends, this group of women who were right there with her in those years, who were often, frankly, better flyers than her, who've all been wrongly sort of erased from the picture. And, that was my second book.
Hmm.
And it was completely different from what I had done in the past because obviously all of those characters, all those protagonists, they're all gone.
Yeah.
There's no one to interview. There's no one to call. I had to really track down documents, journals, diaries, flight logs, memos, court cases, inquests, oral histories. I mean, it was just exhaustive.
Yeah.
And, I know that if I interview you and I'm writing about you, some super, Arkansas Razorbacks fan or whatever, I know that if I'm going to meet with you for 2 hours in your house, like I'm going to find the nut of who you are and I'm going to find the story there
Yeah.
because we're going to talk about it. But in this case, I couldn't use that superhero power that I have, right? I had to live in archives, live in libraries, and I did wonder, am I going to be able to bring these folks, these characters, these heroes, back to life on the page? And so that was an incredible challenge and one I'm certainly proud of.
Yeah. I can see where that took a lot of work, a lot of willpower to get that one to the finish line. But no, I'm always curious again because especially good authors and great authors have put multiple pieces of work out there, and especially on the nonfiction side about other people. What that process looks like of being able to gather all that information and put it together in a way that um, is respectful and tells the real story about who you're writing about. I'm sure there's so much that goes into that to making sure you piece it together accurately, and do it justice for those people. And especially like you said, they're not there, so you've got to figure out how to do that for their families to see it and friends to see it and anyone else that was close to that. And so, no, it's really cool. Keith, I got one last question for you, and I appreciate this so much. This has been such a fun conversation as um, I'm getting all your books on the website, and I've got them all added to my want to read list because these are all stories that I want to dive into just to know more about beyond the surface level. But obviously, you're a writer, and I see a bunch of books behind you, so I know this may be a tough one, but I love to ask people this, and it's what is a book or two that has had a major impact on you, either personally or professionally? And then if someone like me just says, "Hey Keith, I need a book recommendation for my next book," what's one of your go-tos that you like to recommend to other people?
Great question. I mean, I've been, moved and shaped and changed by so many books, so many authors.
Yeah.
Uh, it's again hard to pin down. I'll say this, I was asked recently, like, what's my Mount Rushmore of sports books,
Yeah.
and I write more than sports, and I really am not interested in the box score or the final score or the statistics. I'm writing sports stories because they speak to something broader about the human experience or about the American experience. But because I am drawn to sports stories from time to time, I'll mention a few books that I think would be on my Mount Rushmore
Yeah.
of sports books. David Halberstam, the great late reporter and historian, really influenced me as a young man. If you haven't read David Halberstam books, I recommend them to anyone. He would write about politics or American culture, then also about sports. And his book, October 1964, about the World Series that year and sort of the cultural changes that were happening in America that were reflected in that series, it would be, in my Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
Uh, Laura Hillenbrand's Seabiscuit, I think, is one of the great
I read that book. Amazing.
yeah, great narratives of the past, of this century,
Yeah.
would be, on my list. John Feinstein's The Season on the Brink, A Season on the Brink, chronicling one season with Bobby Knight in Indiana, is a groundbreaking work of sports writing and narrative nonfiction. And then, probably the book that changed me the most when I was in college, and I'm dating myself here, was Buzz Bissinger's Friday Night Lights.
Mm,
I remember exactly where I was when I read it in
yeah.
the early 90s. And I remember thinking how incredible it was that he got access to to the story he chronicled in rural Texas.
Yeah.
And I remember being enamored by that and wondering if I might be able to do something like that. So,
Yeah.
all of those books just fundamentally inspired or changed me.
Yeah.
As for recommendations, I mean, so many. Uh, a lot of them are right there on the wall behind me.
Yeah.
Uh, I'll say this since we're on a Books for Guys podcast. If you haven't read The Barn by Wright Thompson, the great ESPN writer, which really tells the untold story of the murder of Emmett Till in the 1950s and the long legacy of that tragedy. I highly recommend The Barn by Wright Thompson.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't read that, so I'm adding that to my list too. That's a Great recommendation. Thank you, Keith.
You bet.
But, no, man, hey, this has been so awesome. Again, I saw your book come out and I was like, man, and I started digging into more of your work and I just became more and more fascinated, by the books and the stories that you cover. And so, man, keep doing what you're doing, Keith. I can't wait to follow your future work, read all of the work that you've already put out there and share it as much as possible. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chris. Thanks for the conversation and good luck to your Razorbacks.
Thank you.